The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It reads like a page out of George Orwell's 1984, Spies, Secret Courts, and Searches of Americans Without a Warrant. It's clear Big Brother is watching us. Most Americans may not fully aware what is taking place behind closed doors of government spy agencies, but the reality is our government is spying on ordinary, everyday Americans. How? Through an old piece of legislation originally signed into law by President Carter in 1978, called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA. FISA allows government to spy on foreign agents, including terrorists, primarily overseas. The government collects all of this information and puts it into a database. If they want to use or search the database, they go to a secret court, and that court issues a secret warrant to search the database. The court operates behind closed doors and each issues those secret warrants to go after, remember, bad guys overseas. As the subcommittee chairman of terrorism, I have no problem with government going after terrorists who seek to harm Americans. What there is a problem with, Mr. Speaker, is that government uses the database that they seize and then looks in that database about Americans and their activity, violating their Fourth Amendment right because they don't have a warrant to go into the database to look for Americans. Remember, they're searching for terrorists. Here's what happens. While seizing the communications of a suspected foreign agent, maybe an al-Qaeda terrorist talking to another al-Qaeda terrorist, the government incidentally picks up communications of American citizens. These communications may not have anything to do with terrorism. The data is kept. The government puts it in their database, and they say it's legal. The information on Americans was seized based on the secret warrant of foreigners issued by a FISA judge. Occasionally, the government then decides to go into the database that was inadvertently seized, as they call it, seized without a Fourth Amendment warrant on Americans, and checks to see how many times an American name or other identifying information comes up. If they find something, they use this data on the American citizen. Now, Mr. Speaker, they still don't have a warrant to search Americans' information, even if it was incidentally collected. They search the database to see, for example, if Bobby Oglethorpe is committing a crime in the United States, maybe having nothing to do with terrorism. Maybe it's a robbery. Maybe it's IRS fraud. Maybe it violates other laws of the United States. But remember, they're looking for that without a warrant. They seize the information, and quite frankly, we don't know how many times they seize this information on Americans. Our Judiciary Committee has continually asked the intelligence community, how many times have you searched? And they refuse to tell us how many searches and seizures there are on Americans in that database. Very suspicious, isn't it, Mr. Speaker? According to the Washington Post, 90% of the account holders whose communications were collected were not targets, the bad guys overseas. They were Americans. 90% of them. Nearly half of the surveillance files contain names, email addresses, and other data that the NSA mark as belonging to American citizens or residents. So what information are they getting? They get communications, texts, and emails. Without a warrant, remember, secret courts issuing secret warrants, and they don't tell anybody about it. Under Section 702 of the FISA legislation, this warrantless search of Americans is legal. But this, in my opinion, violates the U.S. Constitution. As a former judge, I'm very concerned about the loss of our Fourth Amendment right of privacy in the United States based on this unconstitutional law. The Fourth Amendment is sacred to this country and to the founders who drafted it. It's up to Congress to uphold Americans' Fourth Amendment rights. Despite intense debate in the House Judiciary Committee, I'm still concerned that House leadership is planning to reintroduce and reauthorize the FISA legislation and not have these reforms to protect the Americans' privacy. A reauthorization of FISA with weak language only seeks to put Americans' privacy at stake and violates the U.S. Constitution. Any 702 reauthorization should simply require, if you want to look in the data that was incidentally seized on Americans, get a search warrant or stay out of that data. Otherwise, it violates the Constitution. And that's just the way it is. I'll yield back.
The chair recognizes